noticed that you lost a little hair.
I lost quite a bit of hair, just like my father. He lived to be 95.
That's a wonderful thought. Tell me something. When you were coming over to this country, from where are you from?
I'm very proud of it. I'm from Italy.
By the way, in Italy we don't wear skirts. Don't start getting smart because I said it before, I won't take it from you. Now interview me like a man or just walk out of here. Do you think, sit down then. If you want to be interviewed like a man, you sit down like a man. You think 15 years ago, when you were in your prime 15 years ago, do you figure that you could at least stand a lick of a chance against someone like myself who's in my prime now? There is a big difference. I want you to think. Too hard. I realize that your ears are all nasty and naughty. I know that your nose is smeared all over your face. There is nothing wrong with me. Do you think in your wildest dreams, after 15 years, that you could even come close?
I faced the best in the world, and if you were around 15 years ago, I would have squashed you like a grape, and I'll squash you like a grape now.
Okay, welcome to another episode, and obviously this episode will be a tribute, look back on the life and times and career of Bruno Sammartino, as he was known as the living legend. There you heard that infamous Piper's Pit, a rare live Piper's Pit in Madison Square Garden. I believe that was the summer of 1986. And if you didn't catch the end of that, when all hell broke loose, Piper called Bruno a wop. That's a racial slur for Italians, if those of you who don't know. And what happened after that? Sammartino shoved him, and then, of course, Cowboy Bob Orton Jr. came in with his cast. They busted him open, and they continued to feud for the rest of the summer. Piper, and Sammartino both would face off in a series of singles matches and tag team matches. Sammartino teamed later on with Paul Orndorff in matches against Piper, and Piper would, of course, team with his ace bodyguard. And the feud ended in a steel cage later on at the Boston Garden, where Sammartino won that match. Piper never got pinned. He never did like to get pinned, Piper. Sammartino's final match came almost later, a year later, in a house show in Baltimore on August 29th, 1987, where he teamed up with Hulk Hogan to defeat the team of King Kong Bundy and the One Man Gang in the main event. Sammartino in the 80s would continue to do commentary until he had his falling out with Vince. We're going to talk, quickly touch a lot of things. And just to give those who are not familiar with Bruno Sammartino how big he was and how what he was box office. Okay, we'll cover it. We'll talk about what he meant to wrestling, what he meant to WWF, WWE, and how his legacy stands until today. Now, before we go any further, it's important to understand how it worked back then. And what I mean back then was the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and even 80s. There was not so much companies that like we know of today, like with WWE and Ring of Honor and WCW and so forth. Back then it was territories, of course, I'm explaining this for those who are not familiar. Back then, there was major territories in the United States, with WWE being the New York territory. They were the Northeast territory. There was the Florida territory. Out west, there was San Francisco, Portland. There was Texas, of course, and other points in between. And wrestlers could go and jump from territory to territory. They would spend 1 year in a territory, i.e., company, a year or two, and then they would jump to another one after they got stale, and then they would eventually return. And Bruno, he was the mainstay for WWE for years and 2 decades. Yeah, he would jump to other territories, but it was like a tour, making guest appearances. I don't want to make this episode a biography about Bruno Sammartino. I just want to cover his. I do want to cover his career briefly. We'll move it along. I know we're not sitting in class here. Bruno made his professional debut in Pittsburgh in 1959, December 1959. His first match in Madison Square Garden, the first of many, was January 2nd, 1960, where he defeated Bull Curry in 5 minutes. So originally, his first go-round in WWF, 3 Ws, he was not getting pushed. He felt he was getting held back, so he gave Vince Sr. his notice, and somehow, as history says, he was booked for 2 other appearances, and he didn't know. This is what Bruno Sammartino says in his book. He didn't know, and he got suspended in those 2 territories. I believe it was Baltimore and Chicago, and San Francisco, which is the other territory, also upheld those suspensions. So they basically shut him out. And Bruno explains in his book he honestly believed that Vince Sr. set him up by booking him in 2 territories and not telling him. And back then, that's the way it was. It was these territories were controlled by one person ahead of the territory, and it was all sort of like the mob families, the crime families. You had each territory was like a family, and you had the head of the family. But in the end, the promoters always would stick with each other over the wrestlers. They always kept the wrestlers down, or at least tried to. That's just the way the business is. It's very rarely that you have promoters who just lay down the red carpet for their talent. So Sammartino wrote, on advice, he contacted a Toronto promoter named Frank Tunney. If that name sounds familiar to you, it probably is. I believe that's Frank Tunney, father of WWF President Jack Tunney. And where Toronto has a lot of town people. So Sammartino did go to Toronto in '62, and he started gaining attraction there. Bruno, if you go watch his matches, first of all, it was strong as an ox. I mean, there's as much stories as we heard recently on the Andre the Giant documentary on HBO about his strength. Well, of course, he was a giant, and I mean, he just had a superhuman strength. Bruno, he was very strong. For some reason, all Italians have a strong chest. They could Italians could bench press crazy weights and squats. If you see, look at his body. That was very reminiscent of that was a wrestler. If you see, this is a wrestler's body from back in the day, the 50s and 60s and 70s, before the late 70s and 80s and 90s, when the steroids hit sports and entertainment. And I mean sports and the entertainment world. Listen, let's be grown-ups here. A lot of actors, action stars that we've seen or see, they do the juice. They do a cycle. It's okay. It's not the end of the world. Steroids has a stigma. It's because it's considered cheating. Yes, it's considered cheating when you're when you juice and you're competing in a competitive sports, team sports or single sports. That gives you an unfair advantage. But if you're filming a part for a movie, or even in wrestling, it's aesthetics. The problem with the steroids in wrestling was because too many pro wrestlers started dying at an early age But it wasn't. It's not the. It wasn't really the steroids. I mean, that contributed, but it was other things. But anyway, moving on. Sammartino was really strong. I think he definitely benched over close to 600 pounds. I know for sure. I heard him say he squatted over 600 pounds. That's a lot of weight. And there was even a video where a documentary where he even lifted the front of a small car. So that was his strength. But see, a lot of people think that he was just a brawler or puncher. What made Sammartino so special and so great was he could wrestle any style. So if he was in there with a big heel, strong heel, he would brawl, and he could also then wrestle, as they would call it back then, a scientific match. Well, today we know that as a technical match. He could do it all, and he later on, a lot of fans, as like myself, my age, I caught him in the mid '80s when he was just a color commentator. I didn't know. I'm a little kid. I didn't know about his wrestling background, and back then, without the internet, I didn't have any way to see him wrestle. Yeah, and here's a picture I found online. That's Bruno on the left, and that's Arnold Schwarzenegger. That's definitely mid to late '70s when Schwarzenegger was just racking up Mr. Universe titles all over the place. Another interesting bit, Schwarzenegger is very intricate in wrestling back in those days, and even today, because Schwarzenegger was such a tremendous bodybuilder. A lot of wrestlers would often work out with him, get his advice, train. It was a mutual relationship. I'm sure Arnold was a fan of wrestling back then, but this just shows you. I just pointed this out how big Sammartino was in those days. I mean, meaning celebrity. Okay. So Bruno starts catching steam as a young wrestler, and then finally Vince McMahon Sr. came calling again. Of course, this would be just one of the first of many bumps in the road as far as his relationship with WWE. So Bruno, he told Vince McMahon Sr. on condition he wanted him to put the title on him right away, and McMahon agreed, and Sammartino received the title match against Nature Boy Buddy Rogers, then WWF World Heavyweight Champion, and Sammartino won the title. And on May 17, 1963, in a squash match, he defeated Rogers in 48 seconds. And this began a 8-year run. So he's champion from 1963 to 1971. This is his first title reign. Okay, just think about that. 8 years straight. See, a lot of people today, we talk about, get mad that, Cena, he doesn't deserve to tie Flair, 16-time champion, even though Flair probably has more championships than that. I don't really think the number of title reigns is impressive. All it means is you had favorable booking, or you were just real popular, and you kept getting title matches, and you kept losing. But if you go and really put go on like Ric Flair and Cena, if you go and put both those guys that combined 32 title reigns, if you really examine it, a lot of those title reigns were I know for sure Flair would go into territory, right? We just talked about that, and that still applied to Ric Flair when he was the NWA champion. He would go to another territory, like let's say he would go to Texas to face the Von Erichs, Kerry Von Erich. He would drop the title to Kerry Von Erich or whoever, just to pop the territory, put that performer over. But then on his a few days later or a week later, when Flair would leave that territory, he would win the title back in a rematch, and that's how a lot of times these gaudy numbers got built up. It's not so much impressive. Same thing with Cena. for all the I believe Cena's longest reign was 1 year, but most of his Cena's title reigns were a month and a half, 3 months. That was the average. So I always assert that I care about the length of the title reign, and this certainly is the longest title reign of any modern wrestling champion. 8 years. I mean, just think back a couple of years ago. CM Punk, right? He had it a year and a half almost. That was pretty long. And even now, Brock's had it for over a year. And that's staying power. I'd rather have that. I respect that than in a year, a champion loses the belt 3 times and wins it 4 times. But anyway, moving on. Sammartino was so big in Madison Square Garden because that was his territory. That was the headquarters, home base of WWF at that time. Just sell out. It was smart on the part of Vince McMahon Sr. and a lot of promoters back then. They would go and pick an ethnic champion, Italian or Spanish or whoever. Back then, New York City was very heavy. There was a big Italian-American population, and he just sold it out. He was very popular. I mean, I just can't wrap my head around it. That's 8 years. So just think about it now. We're April 19th, 2018. So if we go back 8 years now, that would be 2010. That's insane. Sammartino would defend against the likes of Gorilla Monsoon. He would defend against Ivan Koloff. I mean, just then the same would be true as other performers from other territories would make their way into WWF at the time and challenge Sammartino. They would bring these big heels and wrestlers to face Sammartino, and it was really it worked. I mean, obviously to keep the championship on him for 8 years. I say Bruno is the man that built the old Madison Square Garden. They would later eventually rebuild a new Madison Square Garden in New York City. So the day finally came when they would Sammartino in shoot interviews, he was tired. Right? He needed a break. And Vince McMahon Sr. Finally agreed and to relieve him. And on January 18th, 1931, Sammartino would lose the championship at Madison Square Garden to Ivan Koloff. Sammartino wrote in his book that he recalled the stunned silence of the crowd after the 3 count. He thought he popped his eardrum. That's how quiet it was. I mean, of course, that's so shocking. After 8 years, you can't believe it. You can't believe your eyes. Again, just look at the Undertaker's streak at WrestleMania ending. Did you see the shock of those people? And yeah, you want to say that's 20-0 and that's over 20 years, but that's like one match. He's undefeated in pay-per-view. He's not undefeated over 20 years. It's a streak. Listen, I enjoyed the Undertaker streak at WrestleMania. It got really over. It got really huge. Fine. It's still making a lot of money. Making the Undertaker and WWE a lot of money, even though the streak has ended. But come on, I think there's bigger streaks better than that. Andre's the Giant's 15-year undefeated streak, undefeated every day of the 24/7 for 15 years. Bruno's championship reign of 8 years. That's a streak also. So almost 2 years passed by. And Vince McMahon Sr. came calling again, of course, because this would be a pattern with Sammartino. They would always call him back because he was just money. Right now, before I go any further, today we see on the internet everybody wants to make their Mount Rushmore of wrestling. Listen, this is it. If you don't agree with it, you can click off the video, unsubscribe, downvote my wrestling Mount Rushmore, in my opinion, and it's tough to beat, is Andre the Giant. You have to have Andre the Giant on it. Bruno Sammartino. You have to have Bruno Sammartino on it. Hulk Hogan. You definitely have to have Hulk Hogan on it. Now the fourth. There's a lot of controversy with this one. I say the fourth has to be Stone Cold Steve Austin. Now I can hear, what? What, Frank? Get out of here, fuck that. It should be Ric Flair or this guy or The Undertaker. No. If you notice, all four men that I picked from Mount Rushmore, it's all box office. They were the biggest draws in wrestling. You can see that Ric Flair drew, but come on, he was not those four guys. Andre, Hulk Hogan, Sammartino. You know, you could say, oh, well, Sammartino, he only sold out the Madison Square Garden. He only sold out a territory. Yeah, he did it for 8 years. He did it for 20 years. And he did travel to other places, and he would sell out other places. He would go to other territories, and he would draw away. Listen, New York City is the biggest city of the world, and even back then, still to this day, it's the Mecca. It's the media capital of the world. Madison Square Garden. Why do you think they call it the most famous arena in the world? The Mecca. If you're the biggest star in the biggest city of the world, in the most famous arena in the world, for the most successful company in the world for 8 years, I think that makes you over, and that gets you on the Mount Rushmore. And Stone Cold, how could you argue against it? His popularity. JR says he had the most. He earned the most money in merch. The 316 shirt alone. Stone Cold. It's reported he made $1 million just on merch in a quarter. That means in 3 months of the year. $1 million. Are you kidding me? So anyway, we'll move on now to his second World Heavyweight Championship, which was 4 years. So now he holds the title for 8 years, takes about 1.5 years to 2 years off, and then he goes on a 4-year run. How many wrestlers you know have held the belts for 4 straight years? Yeah, that was his second one. It's crazy. It is really crazy. So, on December 10th, 1973, Sammartino would regain the belt. He defeated Stan Stasiak. But, almost a few years later, on April 26, 1976, Sammartino would break his neck, a legitimate injury. So that neck injury would keep Sammartino in the hospital for 2 months. He was out of action 2 months. Listen, back then, there was no concussions. These guys, they were men's men. These guys were tough. They were tough as nails. It's not like today's society, including myself. Sammartino suffered the legit neck injury in a match against Stan the Lariat Hansen at Madison Square Garden. It's said that Hansen botched the move, and Sammartino fell on his head. The return match, when he came back, was held in June 25th at Shea Stadium. Also held on closed circuit TV, which they had the undercard on TV, which featured Muhammad Ali versus Antonio Inoki. And it says this match was a match of the year 1976 by a few wrestling magazines. This is the Sammartino match against Stan Hansen in Shea Stadium. So that's another thing WWE would do back then. When there was such a demand for a match, meaning that they would sell out. They knew they would sell Madison Square Garden out in an hour. They would book Shea Stadium, which held 45,000. So that's every time you see one of those old any footage of WWE in Shea Stadium or Yankee Stadium. Or, I don't know if they did Yankee Stadium. That just meant that that match, that angle was such box office that they had to book a bigger place, and still people would get turned away. Imagine that. So that and eventually, the injuries and the grind of the schedule would grind on Sammartino. In '77, he asked McMahon Sr. again. He had to stop, and he couldn't go on any longer. And finally, in an epic match on April 30th, 1977, he faced Superstar Billy Graham, and Superstar Billy Graham defeated him. This second title run lasted 3 years, 4 months, and 20 days. And he would go on to have tremendous rematches against Graham. Of course, he wouldn't regain the title. So after he retired, Sammartino would come back in a commentary role for WWF, and he would become the mentor of, on the left, you see there, Larry Zbyszko. For those of you who don't know Larry Zbyszko was underrated. Huge. He was hugely over. If any of you have the network, you go and watch a lot of those Monday Night Nitros. Every time Monday Night Nitro would start, Zbyszko, he was part of the announce team for Monday Nitro with Tony Schiavone and Bobby Heenan. When the show started, the crowd would go nuts. They would chant Larry, the whole arena, and they wouldn't stop until Larry would turn around and acknowledge him. This happened this became a weekly tradition. So that just shows you how big Larry Zbyszko became. So this, I'm showing you this because this would result in Sammartino coming out of retirement, and as explained by Zbyszko. Zbyszko came up with the idea, and he pitched it to Vince Sr. that if he could bring Bruno Sammartino out of retirement and do this match. Zbyszko explained that they had cold feet. They weren't receptive to it at first because Zbyszko was even back then he was 6'3", 240, and he wasn't big heel. That's what they wanted. They thought it wouldn't sell out. And back then, if you go into shoot interviews, he explains, renting Madison Square, booking Madison Square Garden took a lot of money, and Madison Square Garden would take 70% of the gate. So if a promoter messed up and that card would do bad, it would put the company in jeopardy. But they did agree eventually, and this would bring Bruno out of retirement in 1980 in one of the all-time ferocious feuds. It was student versus teacher. Yeah, you can find this video online on YouTube. Larry Zbyszko attacks Bruno Sammartino, and this would be a pretty strong announce team. McMahon would often partner with Bruno and Pat Patterson. This is when Vince Jr. had just was about to take over, and they were still trying to present wrestling as a real, serious, legitimate sport. Now, this is footage from WWE's weekly TV show. They would, back then, before cable, there was like 6 channels and 7 channels. They would be on Saturdays. Usually, they would have one show on Saturday morning, or eventually, then later on, they would do 2 shows, one in the morning and one at night, one at close to 11 at night. So let's hear this.
To do now is a bit unusual indeed. It is not for those of you who have a weak stock, not for those of you who have a lot of children around. We're going to take you back in time to when Bruno Sammartino was meeting Larry Zbyszko on television months ago. It was to have been a scientific match. Everyone knows the result of that, but that was significant in that it was the beginning of undoubtedly the most bitter feud of all time in pro wrestling.
Yes, Vince. Well, the stipulations for this match was Bruno didn't want. Of course, this is all kayfabe. Bruno was reluctant to return, and Zbyszko got pissed off because he wanted a chance to prove himself against his mentor, the teacher, that he was just as good, if not better. But Bruno agreed that he would come back, but he wouldn't try and beat Zbyszko. See, he said Larry Zbyszko could try and beat him and defeat him and pin him, and Bruno would attempt to not be beat, but Bruno insisted that he would not try and defeat Larry Zbyszko. And as this little match that was shown on local TV, they would hook up, and you would see that Zbyszko would get more and more frustrated as the angle would show that Bruno was much better than Zbyszko. Even a retired Bruno Sammartino came back, and he could still school these guys. And of course, I can't play the video because WWE will strike this down. Even though other people do it, this guy did it. He showed it. And again, each spot, Bruno would get the upper hand, as you see, as he counters with the hip toss, and he was so strong. So you gotta go. I'm gonna leave the link for this down in the description. You got to see how smooth these guys are. And if anybody, I have young people viewing this, and they'll probably say, "Oh, that shit was corny back then. Those wrestlers are corny." Though they work. You know why they didn't have to do 450 splashes and suicide dives? Because they work. They could work. They could tell the story in the ring. And just in this 8-minute match, they built a feud that drew so much money. You could see in each spot, the week leading up to it, how Zbyszko, he felt insulted and by Sammartino, and the frustration grew. And you have Sammartino being the noble wrestler. He's doing all the right things, shaking his hand and holding the rope open for him. But that's it. It was in this spot I'll show you where kayfabe, they bumped and Zbyszko took a patter outside. So, and then you see Sammartino. There you go. He's holding the ropes open for him. He's not being a dick. He's genuinely being. Bruno Sammartino was the ultimate. The character was the ultimate babyface. He was a man's man. He was honorable. That was his character. He was strong, a champion of champions, and he was so good that he didn't have to do anything. He didn't have to break the rules. But then here, Zbyszko finally has enough, and on his way back, he knees Sammartino, knocking him down. He pummels him. He crashes him to the ropes, and I'll let him explain. What the fuck? These let me tell you, I can't find a way to play the sound for these clips, so I have to use my damn tablet.
That was this. I would have never believed in a million years that Zbyszko would be capable of this. And just as you're coming up now, he struck you, and I mean he just laid you wide open. Did you have any of what was going through your mind right now? At this point, I was so bewildered. I felt the blow because I felt the hot blood just gushing out of my head. As you can see, it's bleeding. But again, it's just shooting right out, gushing out. But now, Bruno, this time, by now, you knew. I did, and then you see, I said this time, I said, "You dirty rotten so and so," and this, I got up and left me with a tremendous blow in the head again. And this time, I don't remember anything because that's when the lights really went out, and here I was knocked out. Which, of course, the doctor came in and which was very grateful and tried to kill me right away. But now, with everything that this man has done, now he comes up he's competing to the public. Look at this. I lost so much blood that I had to get blood transfusion that night. I spent the night in the hospital. And
this is the man who's going around saying that I caused this, that I double trouble. I never even asked for the bout. This is what he did to me. This is the thanks that this Judas showed for me after some 6-7 years that I devoted my time, my experience, my knowledge of the game to teach him. But so help me God, Vince, so help me to you. I say to all the fans, next time I get Larry Zbyszko, I will destroy Zbyszko. That is a promise I made to myself and a promise I'm making to everybody.
So then from there, they would have a series of matches, and the most famous one, again, they would face off in Shea Stadium. And then until Bruno retired in WWE, when Hulk Hogan came around in 1984 and he won the belt, Sammartino would do color commentary. The best was those three-man teams with Bruno, Vince McMahon, and Jesse the Body. That was great. I ran out of time, but if you want to, maybe I'll leave the description also. I'll leave the link in the description when he would go on to he says, Bruno said in the shoot interview that in the beginning, Hulk Hogan, after '84, when the initial Hulkamania wave happened, in '85 and even '86, he claims that Hogan wasn't really selling out, and he says it's due to Hogan's style. And it would get old, because in a way he was right. Because I mean, once you saw Hulk Hogan get beat up by the big heel, and then he would Hulk up, and no sell, and then 1, 2, 3. I mean, after a while it would get ridiculous. But Hogan pulled it off. But anyway, this is Bruno Sammartino's words, not mine. So Vince McMahon Jr. He would eventually beg and plead and ask Bruno to come back and do business. Listen, I call bullshit on this. This was done. If he did it on the pretense, because if you heard earlier in the Piper's Pit segment, Piper referenced Sammartino's son, David Sammartino, who was trying to get pushed. Bruno was trying to get his son pushed in WWF in '85 and '86, but Bruno was not. David Sammartino, his biggest crime was he was not his father. He didn't have the charisma as his father. But you know how fathers are, and they're going to push this. They want their kids pushed. And that's why he came back, really, and he did engage in feuds against Roddy Piper, Macho Man. That's another great feud. He even faced off against the Honky Tonk Man, teaming up with Hogan. Sammartino got pissed off and finally had it with Vince McMahon Jr., Vincent Kennedy McMahon, because they didn't want to push his son. And he quit. He just had it, and they went home. Listen, I mean, the guy was there for over 20 years, and, he just called it quits. If the son wasn't going to, if he was trying to get his son pushed, and it wasn't going to happen. Then that was it. From '87 to just recently, when he was inducted to the Hall of Fame, Sammartino had wanted nothing to do with WWF or Vince McMahon. He hated him. He hated Vince McMahon. In the early '90s, when the steroid trial came up, Sammartino, there was not a talk show he would that he didn't fail to appear on and bash Vince McMahon. And then once the Attitude Era came, that was his excuse for staying away from WWE, because he hated the way Vince McMahon had to turn the business into a TNA show and vulgarity. Like I said, Bruno Sammartino's character was that of a man's man, honor, wholesome, clean, so he stood away for a long time. We didn't really hear not too much about Bruno, because if the machine doesn't push you or mention you, people forget about you. That's why WWE is always going to have the upper hand on these guys. But Bruno is so special that he needed to be in the Hall of Fame. And then, as the story goes, Triple H asked Vince if he could call him, and Vince said, "Good luck," knowing that Bruno would never agree to it. But Triple H surprised everybody, I guess, because Triple H, because he's a worm, he plays the good cop to Vince's bad cop, and he gets all these ex-wrestlers who hate McMahon to come back and forgive everything, like the Warrior. Sure, it's not his money he's offering. So, that was it. And now, he passed away at the age of 82. I'm very surprised. I mean, 82. If you heard it again in the beginning of the Piper's Pit, he said his father had lived to 95. And so Sammartino, in good health. I guess they didn't release the details of his death, only that he was sick. I'm going to claim that maybe probably pneumonia. I don't know. Most old people who stay in the hospital at the end of their lives and die suddenly like that, it's probably pneumonia. I don't know. I'm just speculating. Who knows? But obviously, all that wear and tear does take years off your life. If you go and look at pictures of his ears, he has cauliflower ears. It's really nasty. But that's going to probably wrap it up. I just wanted to make this video to explain to everybody and try to paint a picture of who he was. If HBO made a documentary about Andre, they should definitely, in the near future, make a documentary about Bruno Sammartino. He deserves it, and he'll be just as interesting. Yeah, he doesn't drink 200 beers in a sitting, but there's a lot of other things that are interesting about him. Like I said, he has feats of strength, and there's also stories about Bruno Sammartino hanging out with Carlo Gambino, the head of the Gambino crime family, because he's Italian, and when you're a big star in New York City and you're Italian, a celebrity, you're gonna wind up toasting and eating dinner with the mobsters, as it was back then. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I'm going to leave the links to those videos in the description. Let me know what you think. We're at 40 minutes. Believe me, I don't want to go too much longer. Let me know what you think, and leave your comments. Please like and subscribe. I would love to get more subscribers and really keep putting content into this channel. So thank you, and we'll talk again later.